Skyfall is my favorite James Bond movie. Admittedly, I've only seen 3 James Bond movies. I tried watching Goldeneye and I just got so bored 20 minutes in that I turned it off. Sorry, Pierce. I liked you in Mamma Mia. But I know enough about the character through pop culture osmosis to know the general gist. A hard-drinking seducer of a secret agent testosterones his way through a world of Cold War espionage, dropping bodies, panties, and sometimes both. And I know enough to understand that Skyfall is a deconstruction of all of that. Sam Mendez spends 2 hours and 24 minutes picking apart everything wrong with the very premise of James Bond. His substance abuse, his psychological problems, his mommy issues, his total lack of respect for human life, the degradation his physically strenuous job would have on his body, his generally clumsy and ineffective methods of spycraft.
Medical evaluation, fail. Physical evaluation, fail. Psychological evaluation, alcohol and substance addiction indicated. Oof.
And by extension, deconstructs the genre of spy fiction itself. At least, the Martini and Tuxedo version of it. MI6 is outdated and outmatched in a modern world.
Chasing spies. Oh, it's so old-fashioned.
When they report directly to the government, they're hamstrung by a mess of red tape, but when they recklessly ignore oversight, they cause massive collateral damage, narrowly avoid diplomatic chaos, and generally cause more problems than they solve. The plot is not about MI6 defending the free world from terrorism, but clumsily attempting to sweep the fallout of old mistakes under the rug, at the cost of many innocent lives. Modern MI6 is terrible at its job, and even back when it was good at its job, it certainly didn't hold any semblance of the moral high ground that it claimed to.
The handover was coming up and they were on to him, so I gave him up. I got 6 agents in return, and a peaceful transition.
The agency is more concerned with the British government holding on to power than saving lives. Over the course of the movie, James Bond's motivation shifts from defending his country out of patriotism to protecting his only living parent figure because of his personal feelings for her. By the final fight, any preconceived notions of moral or political superiority are burned away, leaving only a battle between revenge and filial loyalty. And in the end, James loses. Silva gets everything he wants. Even after giving up on the lofty ideals of patriotism and country, James can't even win a lowly personal grudge match. Bond has been deconstructed out of existence. And then in the next scene, we learn that he'll be back for the sequel.
So, 007. Lots to be done. Are you ready to get back to work?
With pleasure, M.
Because of course he would be. 007 is one of the most consistently profitable cash cows in the film industry. The rebooted franchise has found the difficult balance of box office success and widespread critical acclaim. It's not like Eon is going to throw away their license to print money just to drive home a point about outdated geopolitical views and colonialism. A James Bond movie has to end on a pro-James Bond note, even if it comes tacked on to the end of a 2-hour thesis on why he sucks. But it still undercuts the impact of those last 2 hours. This is one of the inherent underlying problems with internal deconstructions. There's been a lot of great deconstructions of the spy genre, both satirical and serious, but most of them are one-shots playing around with original characters, and since those characters are not tied to profitable franchises, they're disposable. James Bond isn't. I bring this up because, while the trend of dark gritty reboots has been dying down of late, the trend of hot franchise properties being self-aware seems to have survived audiences' growing boredom with brooding heroes and desaturated color palettes. Things can be bright and fun, but they're obligated to attempt some amount of self-criticism, acknowledging the criticisms of spoofs and deconstructions in canon. Guardians of the Galaxy and Batman Begins might seem to have very little in common, but the aspects that make them unique share a root. The sarcastic lampshading of Guardians and the gritty operatic realism of Batman share the common goal of taking pulpy, mass-appeal entertainment that plays all its storytelling tropes straight and injecting it with a dose of reality. Batman Begins patches its source material's unbelievable elements with surplus military technology and moral philosophy, while Guardians patches them over with self-aware jokes.
So this orb has a real shiny blue suitcase, Ark of the Covenant, Maltese Falcon sort of vibe.
Postmodernism has become a staple of big tentpole blockbusters. But as this becomes the norm for more and more franchises, the limitations of these internal deconstructions become more obvious. Said limitations are visible from the very beginning. While Blade and X-Men came first, it's generally agreed that the Dark Knight trilogy really kick-started the concept of a gritty, realistic, postmodern reboot. Back in 2005, Christopher Nolan attempted to take a franchise that had previously been a vehicle to sell Happy Meal toys and turn it into something cerebral and artsy. Batman Begins was not so much a revival of Batman as it was a justification of him, a thesis on why people should take this guy that dresses up like a bat and fights crime seriously. Here's the problem with that. They shouldn't. Unlike my loose relationship with James Bond, I am an enormous Batman fan. I was introduced to the Adam West Batman show when I was 5 and quickly decided that it was the coolest thing I'd ever seen in my entire life. I devoured everything Batman related at my local library, reading a lot of stuff that was probably not intended for my age group in the process. Batman has been a role model to me for self-improvement, my inspiration for working out, learning diverse subjects, and helping others when I can, so it is with the utmost respect and love that I say this. The very concept of Batman is fucking stupid. I don't just mean the superficial elements, like the cave and the bat costume and the secret identity. Despite what a disturbing amount of Americans seem to believe, violence is not an effective solution for crime. Crime isn't perpetuated by evil people trying to destroy society for personal gain. It's the result of economic downturn, corruption, and failing infrastructure. If you want to know what a realistic version of Batman would look like, they exist. There are actual self-styled superheroes who put on funny outfits and go out trying to fight crime. The vast majority of them are borderline fascist nutjobs that spend their nights picking fights, beating up homeless people, and harassing prostitutes until they land themselves in jail for assault. There is no such thing as realistic Batman, because any world where Batman would be effective is inherently unrealistic. The frustrating thing is that Christopher Nolan is aware of this. The first half of Batman Begins is devoted to explaining to a hot-headed and angry Bruce Wayne that crime is more complicated than he thinks it is.
They talk about the Depression as if it's history, and it's not. Things are worse than ever down here. Falcone floods our streets with crime and drugs, preying on the desperate, creating new Joe Chills every day.
The first time I stole so that I wouldn't starve. Yes, I lost many assumptions about the simple nature of right or wrong.
With all his money and influence, projects like the train his father built would seem to be a more constructive use of his assets than dressing up like a bat and punching things. But this is a Batman movie, so no matter how nuanced and realistic the problem is presented as, the solution has to be dress up as a bat and punch things. There's a disparity between the first and second half of the movie, between Rachel explaining how the economic depression and corruption have gutted the city's jobs and infrastructure, and how violence won't solve the problem that killed Bruce's parents, and Bruce buying a tank. It seems the only thing Bruce learned from his time studying how crime works is don't kill people unless you can find a neat semantic loophole. This gets worse in The Dark Knight. Despite their contradictory nature, the internal criticisms in Batman Begins also served as moments of character development, so they don't feel entirely out of place. And despite being more realistic than previous iterations of the character, Begins still takes place in a more fantastical version of the world. Gotham is portrayed as an almost fairy tale version of an East Coast urban center, so the action on screen can be interpreted as more archetypal and operatic than literal. Maybe this is a world where dressing up as a bat and punching stuff will fix crime. The Dark Knight takes place in undisguised Chicago. While Batman Begins was more focused on theme and character, The Dark Knight spends most of its runtime discussing the civics and politics of superheroing, and the criticisms that naturally arise when it is viewed through that lens, making the disparity between the film's text and its premise more obvious. The most blatant contradiction comes as a result of Nolan bringing one of the more common criticisms of Batman into an official outing of the character. Batman is kind of a fascist. The movie spends a lot of time questioning whether Batman and his allies go too far, whether ceding so much power to someone with no accountability for his actions will ultimately bite them in the ass, and whether the militarization of the police is worth it. The problem is that this is a Batman movie, so by admitting that Batman has some fascist undertones, the movie now has to justify them. Other Batman media tends to just gloss over this aspect of the concept, or exists in such a fantastical version of the universe that the normal questions of civil liberties feel irrelevant. Batman's less-than-ideal treatment of constitutional rights is brushed off as just an unintended consequence of narrative convention in a franchise more focused on character and theme than philosophy and politics. But by attempting to be self-aware and drawing attention to the problem, The Dark Knight either has to condemn Batman, which it can't do because the suits are spending $200 million on this whole shebang and it's hard to sell toys when you've decided your protagonist is evil, or it kind of has to endorse fascism. And look, this movie's really complicated and in my opinion philosophically muddled, and you could easily read any real-world political stance onto its themes and characters, but they sure spend a lot of time questioning Batman's methods without ever really answering any of those questions. And since we end with an inspiring speech about how cool and great Batman is, we sort of get the impression that all the creepy Big Brother secret police stuff he's done is fine. Part of what makes Watchmen such an effective deconstruction of the superhero genre is that its characters are wholly original, and as such disposable. In fact, the whole reason that Alan Moore created original characters for the limited series is that DC wouldn't let him kill off the existing characters he wanted to use. Beneath the myriad of themes in 1980s political satire, the driving through line of Watchmen is that in reality, superheroes are a terrible idea. The heroes in the comic are incompetent at best and the tools of a police state at worst. By the end of the story, all the main characters are either retired or dead. It's ironic that the comic that helped to kickstart the trend of realistic superheroes was about how bad of an idea realistic superheroes would be. Alan Moore's other big deconstruction, The Killing Joke, was also intended to be an out-of-continuity one-shot, like a longer version of the imaginary tales that DC published in the Silver Age, pointing out that Batman is a total lunatic and his villains are mentally ill and suffering at the hands of an uncaring system. The comic ends by implying that Batman murders the Joker, implicitly ending his career as a crime fighter and putting both of them out of his misery. Of course, DC went ahead and folded all of this into continuity and just pretended that the last page never happened, which means now Batman is canonically an unstable crazy person, but because we're now in ongoing continuity instead of a deconstructive one-shot, his craziness is part of the status quo, and everyone just kind of has to be fine with that. The existence of a deconstructive work in an ongoing franchise requires the writers to justify a premise's major flaws when they could previously just gloss over them. And while that sounds kind of cynical, there's nothing really wrong with just glossing over stuff sometimes. It's totally fine to just throw a blanket over the suspension of disbelief that makes a narrative concept possible. Batman doesn't have to be self-aware to be enjoyable. Millions of people enjoyed this character for decades before someone decided a man dressing up like a bat and fighting crime was something we needed a deep justification for. And that doesn't mean that superhero stories can't be smart or mature. There have been plenty of smart, well-written, and socially aware superhero stories that didn't feel the need to deconstruct the idea of being a superhero. Netflix's Daredevil is one of them. The first season of the miniseries is a relatively realistic look at how corruption and fraud works and the legal tools that private citizens can use to fight it, while simultaneously existing in a world where dressing up in red Kevlar and getting into fistfights is an effective crime-fighting solution. It's well-written and thematically resonant, yet it doesn't feel the need to justify superheroing to a cynical audience. It also isn't impossible for a work to both be deconstructive and played straight simultaneously, as long as the deconstruction fits into the character arc. The Amazing Spider-Man pulls it off by deconstructing our relationship with the power fantasies superhero stories provide instead of the literal in-universe problems with costumed crime fighting, allowing the work to be genre-critical without entirely breaking its premise. The criticisms raised are used as a catalyst for character development, as they are criticisms about our relationship with the fantasies of redemptive violence and power presented by many superhero movies,
Feels better, right?
rather than a takedown of the entire concept of superheroes. The problem with Spider-Man is not that he's a vigilante with no jurisdiction, but that Peter is using violence as a band-aid for his own feelings of powerlessness under the guise of genuine selflessness.
He's hunting down a bunch of criminals that all look the same, like he's got some sort of personal vendetta. But he's not protecting innocent people, Mr. Parker.
Spider-Man can keep being Spider-Man without betraying the thesis of the movie as long as he grows as a person, which he does. I have a longer video totally devoted to this movie in the works because oh my god, it's absolutely brilliant and I feel like I'm the only one who noticed. As far as half-hearted postmodernism and tentpole blockbusters goes, the MCU is one of the worst offenders. Since The Winter Soldier, almost every movie has included some kind of self-aware social critique upon which a good chunk of the marketing is built. Is the Marvel Cinematic Universe finally getting political? These questions are forgotten almost as soon as they're raised. The storyline gets distracted by spectacle and character drama before the criticism can be explored in any significant way, and it's been getting worse as the franchise wears on. The Winter Soldier asked the question, can the military be trusted with the power we've given it, and answered it with, yes, as long as it hasn't been infiltrated by space Nazis. But at least the movie ended with the destruction of the weaponized helicarriers that represented gunboat diplomacy. It may not have answered the question that was originally raised, but it did answer a relatively similar one. However, the more recent Spider-Man Homecoming forgets about its big social question basically the moment the opening titles roll. The movie was marketed around class conflict, the working class Vulture versus the one-percenter Tony Stark, with Tom Holland caught in the middle. This could have led to an interesting character arc for Iron Man Jr., with the Vulture forcing him to reassess his idealized heroic view of his superhero sugar daddy, motivating him to get out from under Tony's thumb and become a more independent hero. But after being mentioned in the prologue as the Vulture's origin story, this element becomes totally irrelevant to the action of the movie. The Vulture's resentment of Stark's privileged lifestyle is never discussed with Peter. Despite the villain hating the man the hero idolizes, that element is never used as a motivator for conflict between them. Instead, the movie is built around the theme of adult danger encroaching on Peter's relatively safe teenage existence, the Vulture representing the threat and callousness of the real world, and Peter representing the idealism and naivety of youth. The Stark Peter loves and the Stark Toomes hates never overlap. They may as well be two totally different characters as far as the narrative is concerned. The whole class warfare thing feels like it was tacked on in the edit, because if they built the narrative around the fact that Iron Man is a rich asshole who doesn't give a crap about the working class, it would be hard to root for him in Infinity War. A genuine real-world criticism, which could have been a catalyst for interesting character development, is tossed out the moment it's brought up to preserve the value of the franchise. Interconnected universes and sequels are great. I'm always curious about what's going on with the characters after the movie ends, or what things are like in other parts of their world. But There are some natural problems that arise from trying to craft intelligent stories in the context of a franchise. It isn't even a question of marketability. There have been plenty of smart, interesting movies that made lots of money. It's a question of sustained marketability. If self-criticism doesn't lead to actual change, then it's just a bunch of nonsense. But change leads to unpredictability, and the whole point of an ongoing franchise is putting out a relatively predictable product to a built-in audience. It's highly unlikely that a franchise will ever be brave enough to embrace the change that results from a genuine deconstruction. And that's fine. I don't need my summer blockbusters to be self-aware. I just wish that they weren't obligated to pretend to be.